No. I'm waiting for them to finish reading. It'd be like, those standardized tests. Look up from your paper when you're done. Okay, I'll entertain a motion regarding the minutes unless anyone has any changes. Moved, seconded. All those in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Okay, thank you very much. Public comment. We've got Diana Vargas, Charles Arison, and Mike Alvarez. Ms. Vargas?
Right here.
Thank you.
Hello. My name is Diana Vargas, and I am just a citizen who is concerned with the police oversight as well as the police shootings in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So that is my primary purpose of being here. I would like to say that I would like to suggest that part of the police oversight in general and the city ordinance should include different things, in my opinion. I think they should include maybe no law enforcement whatsoever on the actual task board. And I have been talking with several families who have had their loved ones lost by some type of shooting involvement with APD, and many of them have said this. And I recently spoke with Sylvia Fuentes about an hour ago, and she thinks, as well as many people think, that having law enforcement as part of the main foundation or justifying certain things creates bias, and it creates us and them. And often I've been coming to these meetings, and it seems like it is often us against you, us against different people, but at the end of the day, we're all citizens. And I think at the end of the day, everybody just really wants to be heard, And for instance, he's not here today. Oh, Alan, yes he is. He wanted to be heard so much that he created a motion 3 separate times just to be heard. And when we were in the elevator, we had a little citizen, and she said, "Why didn't they just let him talk?" And I was like, well, that's a really, really good question, right? It seems so simple, but yet it wasn't. Most people just want to be heard. And I think that the 2 minutes that people are granted, it's like a, right? It's like this big array of stuff. And I think if there was something more where citizens could maybe, you could have a special meeting where people could talk longer. Not every meeting. I get we all, have agendas, but people at the end of the day just want to be heard. And I think that the mountain that we're climbing is the same for everybody, and I hope that that is the one that we climb to unite and not divide, because we look foolish when we're dividing all the time, all day, every day. Whether it's the police and you guys, them bashing you at City Hall, right? Whether it's us saying they don't listen or whatever, people just want to be heard.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, please.
Yes.
Ms. Vargas, if I might ask a question. You were talking about not recommending that law enforcement be part of the process. I wanted to be clear, do you mean on a police oversight commission, or the fact that there are former police officers on the oversight task force?
On the oversight task force, I think former police officers create a bias, because I think that inadvertently they're going to be tied, and they see things quite differently when they're, behind the badge, on the streets, making these second-minute decisions, whatever the media is telling us what they're doing. And I think that it creates a bias, because it puts them in a situation where, where this underlying code is being broken, and I think that that is inherent. I think that if you belong to something, you belong to something. I think that there should be like a criminal justice, you know, doctorate or degree where they have done actual studies where they can look at things in a different perspective.
So, Mr. Chair, just to be clear, so that this task force is, as you know, has been going for many months now, and there are former police officers on it. So are you saying that because we have former police officers on the task force, that the work that we're doing is work that you're not trusting? I mean, I'm trying to figure out.
Well, I'm like, I'm sort of in a position where I'm not trusting anything because I don't know what to trust, you know? So, I seek to understand, so I'm coming here, I'm, you know, talking to, you know, different, outfits, you know, whether it's you, the police, victims' families, or people who have been victims of police brutality in general. And I think that it just creates it creates bias, and it creates a strain that whatever decision is rendered, it's always going to be questioned because nobody's ever really going to know, especially when we have been victims of like lies from the media because we're victims of a single story, because it's been the same story told over and over and over again. And if we take that same story and we start it from a different position, then we get an entirely different story. Not that it's any less true, but that it's rendered in such a way that I think faith can be restored.
So, Mr. Chair, one final question then. If this task force came up with a recommendation for a future oversight commission that had a law enforcement officer on it, whether retired or not, who was not APD and was not Bernalillo County Sheriff, what would your thinking be about that?
Again, I think that the blue code is, I think it's universal. I think when something happens, you know, even outside of New Mexico, people feel that, like, especially badges, right? Those who yield a badge, they feel that. And there is a sense to react because somebody has been hurt or somebody has been put in a situation, and it's just part of their nature to want to aid that. And I don't think that it's a bad thing, but I think that it causes friction and interference with rendering a decision, you know, just or unjust for all citizens, because I think it just carries a lot of weight on the individual and their past.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Harris.
Copies of this for all you guys with references in here that you want to see.
Oh.
Evening. In the closing moments of yesterday's POC subcommittee meeting, members expressed their opinions as to Mr. Wagner's and as a citizen exercising his right to defend himself, and may I add the other citizen volunteer members of this panel, the POC, and the concerned public at large, the two comments earlier this week at the city council meeting, and I feel it is necessary that I express my opinion also. Mr. Wagner, I wish to thank you for defending all of us. For a leading member of the Albuquerque Police Force, for one moment to think that he has the right to deny citizens their rights to free speech and the freedom of association by referring to them as a cancer that presumably needs to be cut out is quite telling as to the mindset not only of APD, but of the current city administration. That being said, I thank you, Mr. Wagner, for showing your courage that I can only assume others here will. On that note, I cannot express, as I have done here, cannot express as I have done here before, how important it is, as Mr. Wangman also expressed, that the chief of APD and his willingness to be candid and open to the public is the cornerstone to any and all citizen police oversight. Without that, we have nothing. I would also like to add a couple more recommendations for you guys to take to the city council, hopefully. As I expressed at yesterday's meeting, considering the opinion of the city attorney, and the stipulations of the current ordinance, I recommend that the city council set up an independent panel to write or review any new ordinance before it is set in stone. The vagueness and the diametrically opposed statements in the current ordinance can no longer be tolerated. Make the new ordinance airtight. And lastly, I highly recommend that this panel recommend to the city council that they do everything in their power, as they have in the past, to demand the immediate termination of the current independent review officer, Ms. Robin Hammer, who is clearly not independent. For Ms. Hammer to suggest, as she did at yesterday's meeting, that the city council can fire her at will shows that she has no understanding of the very ordinance that clearly states that the city council has no such power to do so, and that controls her position and responsibilities as the IRO. It clearly shows that Ms. Hammer does not possess the cognitive powers to understand the simple language, and the citizens cannot possibly have any faith in her to perform her duty in investigating any complaint they may bring before her. On the second page here of my statements, there is what the current city ordinance says under 9416 is the independent review office. Under H it says neither the city council or any of its members nor the mayor shall in any manner dictate the appointment or the removal of any such employee of the independent review office. And I stand that the independent review officer is an employee of that office because I believe her pay comes out of that office's budget. And then I also have Ms. Hammer on camera making those statements yesterday, and there's the YouTube link to that video for you. Any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Alvarez.
What I would like to talk to you about today is, I hear that, or have been told that, and I know for a fact that it's getting harder and harder to make a complaint against a police officer. And a lot of these police officers have cost the city a lot of money, and it's just a repeat of the situations over and over again. I have had a lot of situations with police officers, and when I make a complaint, I write a complaint out, and I never hear anything about what they did or what the situation was after the fact. I am an ex-police officer myself, and when I was a police officer, there was no such thing as me doing a cover-up for another police officer to continue doing his thing. You know, if one police officer using his badge for his own situations and another officer helping him do the cover-up, they're both, as far as I'm concerned, breaking the law. We're supposed to do a job for everybody across the board, not I do it for me, I do it for just him. It shouldn't be that way. And as far as I'm concerned, today's police officers is a power trip. A lot of them think because they carry a gun, they got a badge that can do what they want. They feel like they're above the law, and it shouldn't be that way. And I understand that these two people that were before me, the lady was trying to put something across, and I think that's what she's trying to do, that when you have fire police officers in a staff or in a group of an oversight police commission, she's afraid that they're doing a cover-up from one to another. And we shouldn't have that. Because if somebody is breaking the law, we should have the right to be able to make a correction, whether it is to fire the individual or give him 30 days to think about it, to what he's doing wrong is wrong. There's only two things that I was brought up, that when you're wrong, and when you're right, you're right. And one individual shouldn't make a cover-up for somebody else to continue, because he'll never change, and he'll continue doing wrong. And we shouldn't allow this, whether it's a police officer, a fire chief, a security guard, anybody that's in a power situation should not be allowed to break the law more than once. I have never been fired from any of my jobs that I've had. And I quit my jobs when I feel like I'm in the center of a bad situation, then sooner or later they're gonna use me as an scapegoat. So therefore, when I feel like I'm gonna be an scapegoat from one situation to another, I quit. I go somewhere else. Why should I take a chance of going to prison for somebody else's benefit? And this is what the way things should be run, regardless who the individual is. If it's somebody else's brother or somebody else's cousin, we're in the middle of a road where we have lawbreakers here and police officers here that when they see something going down, they don't do their job. When I was a police officer, if somebody was to wave at me, I'd wave back. You try to wave to a police officer today, they smear their nose at you. Is it gonna hurt them or take their power trip away from them because they wave at some individual? Or they see that some individual's in trouble and they stop their unit, put them in a police car and give them a ride home? I know that police cars and police officers are not taxi cabs, but look at how they're using their police cars. Everywhere I go, they got their family going to the grocery store. They got their family going to the post office. They got their families going to a car wash.
Thank you very much.
I've got a question.
Okay.
What is your name again, sir?
Mike Alvarez.
Mike Alvarez. Sir, who have you submitted your complaints to? When you said you filed complaints, who did you file your complaints to about the police or?
Over here to City Hall. And another thing too, I'm glad you brought it up. The time period that they got for you to put in your complaint should be longer than the little bit of periods that they got. You got a very small window to make a complaint. And by the time you get all your paperwork together, by the time you write your letter to make a complaint on an officer, your time has already expired. It should, the window should be a little bit longer.
Well, I think the window for a complaint is 90 days to the Police Oversight Commission. You can file a complaint within 90 days of the incident.
Well, the last time I tried to make a complaint, it was a lot shorter than that.
And if you're complaining to City Hall, you gotta take it to the Police Oversight Commission with the independent review officer.
Well, I wish, I was told that it was less than that. It was less than that when the last time I tried to make a complaint. And then another thing too, I had a friend of mine that had some problems at her apartment, and because the individuals wrote their complaint in Spanish, the officer just put it to one side. He didn't even bother to go to the courthouse to get some interpreters to interpret the police report of what they were trying to tell the police officer. And then he tells the individual, I didn't even know there was children in the apartment where the fight took place. If he would have taken that police report to the courthouse and get it interpreted, he would have found out that there was 3 little children in that apartment. And this is something that we got to correct.
Other questions?
I have one, yeah,
Okay.
a couple. Where were you a police officer?
I was a police officer in Deming, Tularosa, Alamogordo, and Santa Fe.
Oh, you moved around, okay.
And I also worked at the jail, and I was also a correctional officer at the state penitentiary.
Okay, I'm gonna go with what Mr. Arianes told you. You wasted your time going to City Hall. If you had gone to the independent review office, gotten on the website, made a phone call to them, they would have processed your complaint. And I went the very next day
Check in.
after I had a situation. So I think, you know, when you complain about your complaint not being heard, if you follow the process, it's gonna be heard, sir. It really will be.
Well, I went and got the,
But you kept doing it the wrong way, and
I went to
give you
City
credit for
Hall and
doing
got the
it. I
paperwork
give-
that they gave me, and I filled it out.
well, somebody should have told you the truth, but either way, you wasted your time doing that, and they would have processed your complaint. And I know that because I filed a complaint.
Well, a
And-
lot of people don't even know where to
And
go to when there's a
I think
complaint.
that's basically the problem, that people don't understand where they can go. And then
They
go
should
to
be
process.
publicized, or they should,
It should.
paperwork should be put down on telephone books, for example, or at the courthouse. At the courthouse, they don't have nothing where you can go to make a police complaint.
No, it's not at the courthouse.
And then if you have a complaint against a cop and you wanna sue him, you gotta go across the street to the bigger courthouse. You can't do a small claims, report on a police officer. You gotta get involved with a lawyer, you gotta spend a lot of money, and who's got that money to go through the whole process?
That's a court system, yeah. Okay, thank you.
So we have another question. Ms. Konigsberg, you have a question?
Actually, yeah, Mr. Chair, I think your point, sir, is well taken, because the way the ordinance read, it says, the mayor shall designate civilian city staff to receive written citizen complaints. So your point is, where do people find out who these designated civilian city staff members are? I think, I'm not finding it at the moment, but there are other things, but the other places, but the point is that the process is not completely transparent and easily accessible, and that has to be fixed.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, item 5 on the agenda. Process to request legal advice from independent counsel.
Mr. Chair, can I interrupt for one moment? We have a new member to whom we've not been introduced.
Huh? Right, thank you. Mr. Waits,
Yes.
we do have a new member, Mr. Leonard Waits. Do you want to just say a few things about yourself?
Not really, but,
He did send out, although this is his first meeting, for the benefit of those in the audience, I did send out to the full task force information about Mr. Waits' appointment and his background to everyone on the task force. So, welcome aboard.
well, thank you.
When did you say?
I am privileged to be here. I think it's one of the things that's needed for this committee or commission, and I'm happy to be a part of it. So thank you again.
Welcome.
Ready to go to work.
Okay.
Hope you can swim fast.
I can backstroke. So.
Okay, back to item 5 on the agenda. Process to request legal advice from independent counsel.
Mr. Chair, task force members, last time this question came up, I did my best to fill the questions to the extent that I could, but we got to a point in the conversation, given that it's really the realm of the city attorney's office that dealt with many of the questions the task force was asking. We arranged to have Mr. Du Bois here tonight and available for questions. Can I say anything as an intro, John?
Yes, there's an actual ordinance that the city has that applies to contracting with attorneys to provide legal services. And basically, there are only 4 situations in which the city attorney is allowed to go to an outside independent counsel, if you will. And that's if there's a conflict of interest, as defined under our Code of Professional Responsibility for lawyers, or if the city has no assistant city attorney who has the expertise to do a certain case. Excuse me. Or if an assistant city attorney doesn't have the time to do a certain case. And then the last reason is if the city has insurance, where the insurance company has reserved the right to assign counsel to the case, then that can be done. The process would be, if you have legal issues or legal questions or need legal representation, would simply be to put those legal questions in writing and to send them to the city attorney, David Turek. And David Turek will then assign that to his staff, or if he feels that one of these reasons exists for going to outside counsel, he will do that. But it's very, very unlikely. And that we recognize that under your enabling legislation, that you are an ad hoc committee of citizens that have been put together for an important task at the request of city council. And that, your recommendations, you're to make recommendations to the city council. when those recommendations are received at city council, believe me, they will be vetted by everybody. They will be known, people will get up and argue about their wisdom, their legality, and so forth. And that's a very proper place for that to occur. So we suspect that you shouldn't have a lot of legal issues as a task force. Do you have any questions that I could?
Questions? I have a question.
Fire away.
One of the reasons that you gave, and this is just for clarification,
Yeah,
was conflict of interest.
yes,
And I think, I don't want to speak for anybody on the task force, but the sentiment I was getting, the reason for this question was raised, was a concern about conflict of interest. That if we wanted advice regarding the relationship, say, between the Police Officers Association and the city, we wanted an independent interpretation of that, it would be a conflict of interest if it were handled by the city attorney's office. I think that was the
right.
concern.
I do not believe that would be a legal, ethical conflict of interest as described here, which is what is meant. And in fact, if you had a different council who had a different opinion about a union contract or what the Police Officers' Bill of Rights means, or what something like Garrity, what the Garrity decision, Supreme Court decision means, and so forth. The fact of it is that when it gets to City Council is going to be relying on the city attorney's advice, not some outside counsel. And so why not go to the city attorney to begin with?
Thanks.
Mr. Du Bois, who determines expertise? Would that be Mr. Turk? He said we want someone with specific expertise. And
Yes,
and Mr.
that would be
Turk
Mr.
say,
Turk.
then we have what we do.
Right.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have
Okay.
one. I don't have the opinion in front of me and I haven't read it for some weeks, but Mr. Turek's opinion about an analysis of who gets to say what about whom with respect to the independent review officer and who's in charge. And the analysis went into a great deal of discussion about separation of powers. And I'd have to look at it again to figure it out, but the question I have is, as far as you know, and this is leading to whether or not this would be a situation that would create a situation. Is Mr. Turek's analysis strictly an analysis of his opinion of what the ordinance, current ordinance as written says, or was Mr. Turek's opinion an analysis of the fundamental principles underlying any police oversight commission, and that no matter what ordinance anybody comes up with, the internal separation of powers that Mr. Turek was putting within the police oversight process is a necessity. And I'll tell you now, if Mr. Turek's position is that separation of powers within the police oversight process is a necessity, then I think we have a conflict because we need legal advice to see whether that's true.
Well, it's making me a little nervous because, because of the Open Meetings Act, it has to be on the agenda. I know you're tying it to the notion of conflict of interest and whether or not.
I'm not making a motion now. I'm asking you, can you tell me what,
Right.
just as far
I
as.
can tell you that it is based on the reading of the current ordinance.
All right.
And general legal principles of statutory interpretation. And that includes a separation of powers analysis, but that analysis is applied to the statute, the ordinance as written.
So if we were to ask Mr. Turek to work with us, if our determination was that we wanted to recommend a process in which there was no internal separation of powers,
and we wanted the lines of authority to go in a different direction than what Mr. Torek says this ordinance does, we could enlist his support, his aid in drafting that recommendation, whether it be what the council ultimately wanted or not.
Absolutely. And in fact, let me give you an example, an excellent example. The city council passed an ordinance for the inspector general. Explicitly in that ordinance, it says that the inspector general is not under the executive branch or the legislative branch, and is independent from both. All right, and that's very explicit within that ordinance. It might be something that you would want to look at, and so yes, it is doable. The thing that you would be looking out for is the thing, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't set it up so that some part is reflective of the legislative branch and another part is influenced by the executive branch, and then say there's no, but they'll behave like there's no separation of powers that become involved, because that would just be unworkable. But you could certainly set it up so that they were neither legislative nor executive. So certainly separation of powers wouldn't come in.
Other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Rizzo? Okay, we're up to item 6 on the agenda, reports of subcommittees. Each of the subcommittees has had either 2 or 3 meetings. So I'm going to ask each chair or whoever the subcommittee designates to make a brief report. Why don't I start on my left? I'll go left to right and start with Mr. Peter and Mr. Simons in the POC subcommittee. If you're prepared.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me just ask, I'm looking over the packet of materials that was distributed for the meeting, and at least my first take on it, I didn't see our report actually included. Is it in there and I just missed it?
Let me see.
Mr. Chair, I didn't include it because I hadn't talked to you because you wanted to distribute. I can certainly go make some copies of it.
Yeah, I think we should probably hand it out, and maybe Mr. Wagman could do his report, and I can talk with him.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. The IRO.
Right, and we produced 2 documents. Somewhere early on, it became apparent we had disagreement, and given that it was up to me to produce the report, I didn't think it was appropriate to have, just because there was a 2-to-1 vote by the happenstance of how who happened to be a member of the committee, that the minority voice wasn't heard. The materials are here. I would say that the split on the subcommittee, and Mr. Bertoletti can correct me if I misstate it, is between basically a desire to have the POC be in complete supervisory charge in terms of hiring, supervision, and ability to terminate the IRO, and that the IRO did its work at the direction of the POC, and that the POC have more ability, increased ability to do investigations. And the other view was primarily that the main purpose of the IRO and the whole process of the IRO would be to do all the investigation and lessen the reporting to POC, and have the POC be receiving reports from the IRO and making policy recommendations based on those reports. And I'm overstating and oversimplifying, but the recommendations of each are there. So there was a split of opinion, and And it came down to basically strengthening the POC or moving more of what the POC is now doing to the IRO and not giving the POC the hiring supervision and firing power over the IRO. So the firing power is really what makes the IRO, determines who the IRO answers to. And that was one area of disagreement. And the other was basically to what extent is the POC going to be involved in investigations?
Before I entertain,
Directing IRO investigations.
before I entertain questions, Mr. Berlin, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, it's just,
There was
you
a
know, I mean,
majority
that was
and a minority.
basically accurate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Wagman. Yeah, that was basically accurate in terms of the differences of my recommendations. The tack that I took to my, to prepare that, first of all, it was a draft that was, so we kind of ran out of time to even hash it out at the subcommittee level, frankly. But be that as it may, my approach was one, perhaps, what I was trying to do is come up with a set of practical, more practical recommendations to set up a process that would then lead us to having the more detailed information and the more detailed recommendations. And as you can see, I focused on three basic issues: the transparency, independence, and resource allocation. And what I'm suggesting is that the POC IRO function be set up as a quasi-public entity, much like in the Independent Review Office that Mr. Dewar was just talking about. There are plenty.
The Inspector General?
Inspector General, I'm sorry. Inspector General's office. That ordinance could be, made to fit a little differently. But basically, there are lots of examples of how to do that. Staff and sent out lots of information on that issue. The second point is resource allocation, and I think in order to provide enough resources to the system that are protected from the annual budgetary discussions to some degree, it would be helpful to set aside a special fund based on some percentage of the police department budget or some other way of calculating that budget, but set it aside so that it's a little more sheltered. And thirdly, in order to have a little more independence in terms of the hiring and firing, I'm suggesting that perhaps a special committee be set up with by the mayor and the council president or their designated representatives, plus a third person picked by the two at large, a retired judge or perhaps the chair of the POC could fit on that committee. That committee would have the authority to be the ultimate decision maker in disposing of complaints, because that was an issue that right now goes right back to, at the end of the tail, the complaint goes to the CIO for final disposition. So that would remove it to some degree from that. And that office would also, that committee would also have the power to fire the independent review officer rather than the POC or, the council being the ultimate decision maker anyway, in all instances. And that was my approach to it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Just one quick thing, I just want to point out, we all agree the IRO needs more money, more staff.
Right. Yeah, and we agreed actually after I saw the majority report, we have a couple of other points where we actually agreed, so that was good.
So that this fights were unnecessary.
Hallelujah.
But the first meeting.
Praise the Lord.
At the
Give
first
again an
meeting,
amen.
we agreed immediately that the subcommittee would not be able to solve the world problems, and that was unanimous.
Okay. We're not, just for clarification, we're not gonna vote on these recommendations tonight. So we don't wanna get probably too deep into the weeds, but are there any questions for the IRO subcommittee? If not, I'll move up.
Actually, we just had a sidebar conversation here, Mr. Chair.
Oh.
I think this is, it's a relevant question.
Okay.
In figuring out the structure and the line of authority for the IRO, do you know or have any recommendations of where the IRO's salary comes from? We were having this discussion yesterday in terms of the independence. Is if the IRO is overseen by the Police Oversight Committee, where's the funding stream? Does that come out of the mayor's office? Does that come out, I mean, we were talking about this and Steph maybe even clarified that.
We did, yeah.
Because I didn't walk away with an answer to that question. So in terms of independence,
It's the mayor's office.
Yeah,
I believe
address
we-
that question, Mr. Chair. Currently, the Independent Review Office is funded out of the Chief Administrative Office program in the budget. He is part of the mayor's office, of course, but they have a separate line item for police oversight, and that's where the IRO and POC budgets.
Thank you. Other questions? Peter, are you ready, or should I?
Sure.
Okay.
Let me, I'll go ahead and distribute the recommendations from our subcommittee. Wait for a second for it to make its way down the row.
Is it just one page?
Yeah, just one page from the back.
Oh,
Okay, I think everyone's got it.
So just a couple of comments about the process. I have to say that this was a much more complex endeavor than I think any of us had anticipated. And just as Member Allen pointed out, the issues that dominated our discussion were, number one, the degree to which the POC delves into the individual complaint process and involves itself in reviewing complaints and the findings of those, on those investigations of those complaints. And second, this issue of whether or not the POC has supervisory authority over the IRO. But having said that, let me, and maybe I'll come back to some of that as we go through these recommendations. Of course, our first recommendation, we really backed up all the way to the 30,000 foot level and just asked the basic question: should the POC be retained as a structure within the overall civilian oversight structure? And we agreed that it should be. That at least a POC, maybe not this POC, but a POC should be retained as part of the structure. We found that, one of our recommendations, and maybe our major recommendation, is that the POC should primarily focus on and address systemic problems in APD, and that it should involve itself in the individual citizen complaint process to the degree that it drives a policy agenda or assists in the assessing of systems implications, of helping to identify patterns of abuse, patterns of problems that would ultimately inform the other kind of work it would do. So along those same lines, we recommended that where the POC's recommendations to the APD are concerned regarding a policy matter or addressing systemic problems that are identified, that the APD should be required to provide, and this should probably read, APD chief should be required to provide written response to the recommendations. And if the recommendations are not followed, a limited explanation of why not. We felt that the POC, like the IRO subcommittee, we agreed that the POC should oversee the IRO, should supervise the independent review officer, We're concerned that the existing POC is underqualified to actually perform that function, so we don't agree that this current POC should have that authority. And I have to say that this was not a unanimous, this is, I think, our only not unanimous decision within our committee. Member Mijo actually opposed the recommendation, and I should add that, you know, after thinking about it more, I think this is an issue that, while we've made this recommendation, and I have shared some of the same thoughts that the IRO subcommittee has, it's my feeling that this is an area that we should study more closely. Because at the end of the day, it seems to me, and I think many others will agree, that the place we know that the civilian oversight structure is working is where the IRO is reviewing citizen complaints, having findings, recommending some action on those findings to the APD chief. That appears to be the best functioning part of the overall structure right now. And we don't want to do anything to the overall structure that could compromise that function if it's working well right now. And so that's not to say we shouldn't follow through with the recommendation of the POC overseeing the IRO, but I do think that we would want, as a task force, to devote some more careful examination to that question before we follow through with that recommendation. That would be that's not a subcommittee's opinion, that is my personal opinion. Selection of POC members, we struggled to come up with a format for how the POC members should be, the process by which they should be selected, but we did come up with a sort of a format for the POC that it should consist of 9 residents of the city of Albuquerque, and that 4 of those residents should be expert positions, and they are largely attorneys skilled in the particular areas that the POC deals with. And then 5 at-large positions, I've described them, they're described in parentheses here as business owner, community activist, etc. Those are only intended to be suggestions. They could be any stripe of at-large member and any stripe of background that people might come to those positions. We agreed that the city council should be responsible for appointing those positions, that the selection process should be subject to the Open Meetings Act. However, we did not really get into the finer workings of how the city council should receive, for example, recommendations about those appointments. Should there be a separate committee that reviews applications, takes in applications from the community, and then makes recommendations that the city council can follow through with or not at its discretion? We didn't get that far. We agreed that the POC should be entirely independent of the branches of city government, and I think, while it's not stated here, I think we were thinking something analogous to the Inspector General position that was mentioned earlier. And then finally, we felt there were a number of administrative changes that we thought that we had intended to get to, and we were only able to get to one, and that is we were unanimous in feeling that POC members should be compensated for their service. I should add that this particular recommendation, as well as the recommendation regarding the selection of POC members, was made without a member of Perea in the room, unfortunately, and I don't know whether he would actually support these particular recommendations. They were the vote of the people that were present.
I do agree with that.
Okay.
Just for the record.
Okay, great, thank you. And there are a number of outstanding issues that we would like to get to, and it might be that these are areas that the task force can devote some attention to in the coming weeks. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions?
Actually, Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
Peter, just because I don't think members of the public have a copy of our report, the 4 expert positions specifically would be a criminal defense lawyer, a prosecutor, a public policy expert, and a police officer not affiliated with APD or the Sheriff's Department. And I wanted to say that out loud since I know that that's the concern.
Thank you.
So that was, so I think that's something to be discussed, given some other public comment. The other thing that I think is really important to understand, and what I at least personally struggled with, is that the recommendations for the POC essentially tending toward focusing on policy, systemic, and training issues was based on the, for lack of a better way to describe it, the ironclad independence of the independent review office and officer, and having enough staff to do that job adequately, because this would move the Oversight Commission from being a hearing and fact-finding body, unless it used its discretion to do so, and it would choose, if its discretion would be its discretion, nobody would second guess the POC on it. But it is divergent based on the independence and thorough funding of an independent review office. So I just need to say out loud with some trepidation that I went that way, but I think ultimately for an investigative arm to do its job, it needs to be funded well, and for the POC to be able to do its systems analysis that and recommendations that the IRO office, its staff, people who can actually, with enough people who can do the data analysis to produce the kinds of information that the POC would be looking at. So,
Mr. Chair, if I can just add to that point, I passed over an element of the, on the relationship with the POC to city government. Again, we believe the POC should be entirely independent. We felt like one mechanism to help ensure that would be to ensure that in order to ensure adequate funding, the POC ordinance would tie the POC IRO budget directly to that of the APD and set the budget at no less than 1% of the APD's total budget. And I think that was one of our more important recommendations.
Okay, thank you both. Questions?
Well, a question for future, because we don't have time tonight.
Okay.
But my concern about the issue that Nancy just spoke about is certainly a large part of the expressed public dissatisfaction with the process is the lack of transparency, the at least apparent lack of transparency of the way things are being handled through the independent review office. And my concern is, and when we get to it, I would like the subcommittee members who have talked about this to address the issue of, by taking the commission out of the business of, backing them even more out of the business of looking at complaints and investigation directly, how will the existing public concern and distrust of the process be addressed? Because it seems to me that's going to increase the level of concern based on the comments that we've heard, rather than alleviate them. Even if the system works better, the public perception, I don't see how it matches. So when we get to it, I'd like to hear from the subcommittee what they said, how they address that.
They did discuss that.
I'm sure they did. I'm sure we don't have time for it now.
Right. Okay, Mr. Arianes.
APD committee.
Yep.
Okay, I'm the chairman, Ralph Arianes, and Craig Lloyd is also on the committee of two. We were going to meet last week with Lieutenant Jordan. He's in the back of the room there. But he wasn't able to make the meeting. I think there was a conflict, so Craig and I met for a couple of hours and discussed a lot of the issues. What we did was go over exactly what the notes that were taken from the town hall meetings and formulate questions that were from the town hall meetings, and then information that we also had together. And then, of course, I met with the Lieutenant Eric Jordan day before yesterday, Monday night, and Craig was out of town, so Craig has only had a chance to review the information that we put together now. But it was basically based on our discussions of what we had. Now, we have an agreement on probably about 80% of it, and disagreement probably about 20% of it. So I think I'll kind of quickly go over those that we agree on, and then kind of touch base on the ones that we don't agree on. Number one, division of labor between IRO and IA, internal affairs, IA. Should all citizen complaints be handled by the IRO, and all internal APD complaints handled by IA? We agreed that all citizen complaints that include physical or verbal assault should be handled by the independent review office. Citizen complaints about traffic violations should be handled by internal affairs office. the charter of sanctions for disciplinary actions should be used as needed. If an officer has 3 or more citizen complaints about traffic violations, they should be referred to the IRO for their investigation and possible disciplinary action. So we agreed on that. I'm gonna go over the ones that we agreed on first, and then get to the disagreement.
Excuse me, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Chair, is there a handout with your,
No, there was not, at this point,
okay,
okay?
I'll stop looking.
Sorry about that. Committee recommendation, on number 2 here, we both agree that a video camera and bell tape should be mandatory for every police officer on duty. It is the responsibility of the officer to ensure that all equipment, to include the bell tape and the video camera, be in proper working order at all times. Every police officer should have a video camera and a bell tape assigned to them. The APD must maintain, and this is our recommendation, a 20% spare inventory of video cameras and bell tapes in order to cover for damage or loss of video cameras. So for example, if we have 1,000 police officers on the APD force, the APD should have a bell tape and a video camera assigned to each officer and maintain an additional inventory of 20% or 200 video cameras for belt tapes or last items. And we, when in speaking with Lieutenant Jordan on Monday, it seems like APD is in the process of ordering some much better cameras, much better high quality cameras, and they are going to have spares so that if one malfunctions, that will be available for them to pick up and proceed from that. So I think that's heading in the right direction, and we have agreement.
The 20%, I don't know.
At some point, we'll see. Use of video cameras, belt tapes is a must. An officer should not be allowed to go, oh, okay, this is the comment. Use of video cameras or belt tapes is a must. An officer should not be able to go into the field without an operating camera any more than he or she should be without operating their firearm or radio. We agreed on this one that progressive discipline according to the charter sanctions should be applied as needed. All cases where a police officer did not have a video camera or belt tape in their possession while on duty must be referred to the IRO for investigation and discipline action. It is very difficult to mandate that a police officer not go on duty without a camera because an electronic recording device can malfunction and the community cannot afford to not have an officer patrolling the streets. That's why we need the spare inventory of cameras in order to immediately cover for damaged recording devices. If an officer continually has a problem with damaged cameras while on duty, then this matter must be referred to the IRO for their investigation and potential disciplinary action. In all cases where the recording of an incident does not exist, must be fully investigated by the IRO. And we heard this over and over by the town hall meetings. Another one where we agree is should the chief of police be required to give a formal explanation of why she or he does not concur with the IRO's findings? Absolutely. In every case where the chief does not agree to the IRO's findings, the chief must be required to give a formal explanation as to why he or she disagrees. The matter must then be referred to the CAO, Chief Administrative Officer, for a final decision. Are there ways to improve the model for mediation so that it's used more regularly for certain kinds of complaints? Who and how should the mediator be selected so that it is seen by all as an independent party? This goes into a lot of discussion, and we're still going to work on that. But I think the mediation process is working pretty well. We just felt like there should be agreement between the citizen complaining and the officer about mediating. And I think it's pretty clear about both sides agreeing to mediate and then proceeding from there. Should there be pre-screening of the police academy regarding temperament and mental fitness of police officers? And this is one of them that we didn't agree on. But we all feel that recruitment of top-notch and quality officers should be a top priority with APD. The history of the police brutality and police misconduct within the culture of APD is well documented. This is why the US DOJ is conducting their investigation and why the Police Oversight Task Force was formed. It is better to have a small quality force of well-trained police officers than a large one with many bad officers. The saying, one bad apple spoils the whole bushel, cannot be overemphasized here. A bad officer reflects poorly in the entire department and the community. So we're still working on this one about how the process works. I didn't appreciate the information that the lieutenant shared in this area, and I think we can come to some agreement in that area. The one where I think we have probably the biggest disagreement right now, and I thought we had agreement, but yeah, we don't yet, so. How and under what conditions can or should the IRO's conclusions about officer discipline be mandatory for the police chief? And the committee recommendation, if an investigation has been conducted by the IRO's office and the charges and allegations against the officer have been sustained, the IRO's direction for disciplinary action against the officer should be mandatory. Once the chief of police has applied the disciplinary action against the officer has a right to appeal to the chief administrative officer of the city for final decision. So that's one where we have not come to agreement on. And so, did you want to share something in that area, Greg?
As Ralph said, in fairness to Ralph, he put this together without me present because he had to. We had a meeting scheduled for Tuesday night and Monday night, and I had it on my calendar as Tuesday, so I scheduled out of town work. So we do agree on most of that, and I can see why the IRO imposing discipline was somewhat confusing, because we talked at that, most of our first meeting was based on that.
Yeah.
We did talk about the charter sanctions being involved, the IRO making recommendations, and if the chief fails to follow his recommendations, then it certainly should be in writing as to why we're not following those recommendations instead of just a flat out no. So we'll work on that some more. The pre-screening, we disagreed on some of that stuff. And in fairness to myself, it wasn't because I don't want pre-screened officers. It was the fact that we disagreed on something done because APD, they have their psychological test, they have their polygraph test, they have their drug test, they have the physical fitness test. I mean, there's a lot of tests that they do take, but we were just going over some other stuff that possibly will make a better police officer. We just couldn't quite reach it there on that. On the belt tape and the disciplines, the officers carry the belt tapes. Just to expand on that a little bit. We talked about at length about that. I say on Monday night, my sergeant would tell me, well, you better make sure it's charged Tuesday or next Wednesday. And if it's not charged then, and again, if we're seeing a pattern here, that's certainly an issue that we ought to be looking at, that ought to be looked at. But the officers can forget to, and I'm not familiar with these, I've been gone 11 years, we didn't have lapel cameras, and the tape recorders we had are now sold at Walmart for $9.95. But we didn't have the equipment they do today, so I'm not real familiar with it. But I do know that if you have just one particular officer and their equipment's always not working, the supervisor is going to be looking at it. They're going to say, you know, there's a problem with this. There's something going on here. It's not your equipment. It's you. You're not taking care of your equipment. Just like APD has policies, SOP guidelines that say officers will maintain the equipment in working order. And I don't think that's probably changed at all. So we're almost there on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, like I said, I think we're about 80 to 85% in agreement. So I want to thank the lieutenant there for making time Monday night. And it was a good meeting.
Thank you. Questions?
Mr. Arias, Mr. White, just a little clarification on the video camera versus the belt tape. Now, is it either or under what circumstances can an officer have a belt tape versus a video camera, or is that only when a video camera is not available, then the belt tape is used, or how's that decision made?
And you can chime in after me, Craig. I believe that both should be available with the officer, the officer to have both, because as we talked about earlier, sometimes one may malfunction. So let's say the video camera malfunctions on an incident, or is torn off, there's a scuffle going on. You know, gotta have some kind of recording to document the confrontation with the issue. So I think it's important to have both. A lot of times, a video, it's dark at night, or something that happened and you may not get proper video. But it's always good to have the belt tape as a backup. I think anytime we're dealing with electronics, you need to have some kind of a backup.
Now, as far as the input from the APOA president, one of the concerns that she expressed on behalf of the officers is that the camera itself can sometimes be, it might not be practical under certain circumstances, but if
they have two devices, are we asking a lot more of the officers that they're trying to manage two recording devices, video camera, and if that doesn't work, then immediately go to a bell tape?
Well,
The
I mean,
equipment they have, are we creating?
How is I've never been a police officer, but how is an officer to know if a video camera has malfunctioned during an incident?
Right.
Nobody's gonna know. I mean, from what I gather from the lieutenant, that the new cameras that are gonna be coming out in February and March are much higher quality, much better reliability than what's currently used. Unfortunately, they're a lot more expensive, but that's the price you pay for a better product. But I believe that, and you can chime in anytime you want, Craig, but I believe that a video camera and a bell tape should be used at all times.
In a perfect world, I certainly agree that both devices are good. And again, I think it comes down to the situation at hand. As a police officer, I rolled up on several calls where my concern wasn't getting my belt tape turned on, my lapel camera turned on. It was bailing out of the car so I didn't have people shooting at me. That never did occur in my whole career. I never shot at somebody who had somebody shoot at me. I did have people threaten me with knives, and I had an individual pointing a gun at me, but I knew it was empty because I hid around the corner while he shot all his rounds off. But there's cases, I think each case should be looked at as an individual case. In a perfect world, absolutely, belt tape and the camera. I think it's a sad world when we have to have all these types of things, but it's just the world we are in today. That's just what it is.
Yeah.
So I think we can have both, but I would certainly hate to see discipline starting to be handed down to officers that had one or the other working, and they didn't have both working.
No, I don't think, I don't think that's discipline. I think the objective is to have some recording. I think ideally is a video camera. But again, I mean, what kind of quality of video are you gonna get at night? Or if the video camera does malfunction?
Just, I don't want to get into too much debate tonight on specific issues, because we didn't do that with the other subcommittee reports either. So I'll entertain brief questions and maybe brief responses, but I know that we're gonna have a lot of time, well, I don't know about a lot of time. We're gonna have time where we're gonna have to go through debating particular issues and having different views on it and come to consensus on that. So I want to avoid doing that tonight.
One more question, just a yes or no answer. Just
Sure.
gives me time. Did your subcommittee discuss, as it relates to video cameras, how long or whether those video cameras would be run from the beginning of the officer's shift to the end of the officer's shift nonstop? Was that issue dealt with at all?
Well, to my understanding, the current lapel cameras don't have that capability, but the ones that are gonna be coming in, starting February, will have that capability to run 8-9 hours. So,
We can discuss that.
yeah.
Did you have your hand up, Mr. Sines?
No.
Okay, any other questions for this subcommittee? Okay,
I'm going to make some brief comments, if I could.
sure.
One of the issues during an investigation is that the camera malfunctions. And I mentioned this before, that there's, in an investigation, you have to prove or disprove whatever you were told. And there's no follow-up to make sure that in fact the camera malfunctions. They're not toys. They cost, what, $150, something like that? And there's no record saying that the officer turned it into his management. And I think some of that has to be addressed, because if the IRO is going to make a good determination, she needs more proof on these cameras. And there should be some sort of system. Secondly, when they're hiring police now, they have to have 60 hours of college work and ex-military.
Ex-military is not a requirement.
No, but I mean, they're looking for people like that.
Sure.
And I'm wondering, when they talk about ex-military, are they looking for ex-security police officers? And are they looking for people with degrees in criminology or philosophy or music? I mean, does the police care about that?
Well, I mean, I'm not in the business of recruiting police officers, but I think that, formal education of any kind is important. Whether they have a police criminology kind of degree or an accounting degree, I think the objective is to ensure that there is an officer that has an education that's competent to write, and competent to read, I think the objective is competency. Is an individual competent to function as a police officer, whether they have a music degree or a law degree or an accounting degree?
I would just, well, I don't want to get into it, but
Well, and if I understood your report correctly, the two of you are still kind of hashing out screening
Yeah.
and qualifications.
We are hashing out screening.
Okay,
okay,
so
don't just let it go like that. I have more, but I'll let it
they're
go.
not quite ready for that.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Ms.
Thank you.
Konigsberg.
Thank you, guys.
Mr. Chair, gentlemen, in the MGT report, there was another section about other APD accountability mechanisms that talked about the early warning system, and use of force reporting, risk management, and access to records. Did you all look at those as well?
We did.
Okay.
We did talk about the emergency, the early warning system. And it's our understanding that there is software that assists with analysis of data and tracking trends. And some of those trends that we talked about that perhaps should be tracked are resisting arrest and failure to obey. So, I mean, we've all heard of contempt of cop. You know, made me angry, I'm gonna arrest you. You resisted arrest, you failed to obey. We have been discussing that, we're still touching base on it, so we are going
Okay,
there.
so you will go through the rest of
Yes.
the points? Great, thank you, appreciate it.
Other questions?
Well,
Mr.
just as a
Simons.
follow-up to that very point, I think our subcommittee didn't do enough to review the MGT recommendations and how they met up with our own recommendations. And I mean, I do think that as we move forward, and it sounds like we're going to move forward in a collective capacity, that should be a formal part of the discussion, because as I said the other day, I think there may be some low-hanging fruit there where we could easily agree on some of these MGT recommendations and include them without a whole lot of hassle. So it's not the time to discuss it now, but as we go forward, I think we should keep that in mind.
Anyone else? Okay, let me introduce Mr. Timothy Karpoff. Mr. Karpoff has been reached out to from City Council as a potential facilitator. He has a long history of working with City Council in facilitation process on a variety of thorny issues. And with that, I'll turn it over to him and let him tell you more.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the task force, good evening. Thank you for the invitation to come tonight, and thank you for the work that you do. I met with the management subcommittee last week, and as I said to them, I think the work here really goes to the heart of how we seem to find ourselves as a community. So thank you very much. The idea, as the chair said, is to consider whether it'd be useful to engage a facilitator, a third party, to help with the deliberations as you get to crunch time, if you will, trying to get these recommendations into a report in time for Mr. Froman and others to put it together. And particularly, would it be more efficient to allow the chair to engage substantively in these deliberations and sort of separate the process and content roles of that? So what I'd like to do is two things. One, let me just introduce myself briefly, and then I have a suggestion on process guidelines or a framework for going forward. It's really a set of talking points to engage you all and just sort of see whether it'd be useful to go forward together and find the right guy, so to speak. So let me just say I'm an independent consultant. I'm a planner and facilitator. My wife and I have been here in Albuquerque since '91. I have a community development background. There's a one-page resume somewhere floating around.
Yeah, we're okay.
And so I get involved in a lot of public conversations. And I'm very interested in how we can improve the quality of our public discourse. And one action research question I have, is it possible to speak with candor and respect in public about important matters equally, so that we can actually possibly enrich relationships across some of the things that conventionally divide us. I think that may be naive, but I go forward with that optimistic point of view. Maybe I should just describe a couple things I have done. Recently I was working with the county on Bridge Boulevard. They want to revitalize Bridge Boulevard with a HUD DOT Tiger 2 grant. So I was the public outreach guy as a subcontractor to the engineer. Another one, I was here a couple weeks ago in this room helping with the Rail Yards Advisory Board, and I've worked with them a couple different times and ways. So before they picked a master developer, as they were trying to get an RFP, they asked me to help facilitate those meetings. It was a couple years ago. And then as they're trying to get the master development plan through the advisory board to the Environmental Planning Commission, the chair, Councilor Benton, thought it'd be better if he could actually talk substantively, and so they asked me to help run the meetings and even call for motions and votes and so forth. A couple of years ago, I actually facilitated a so-called Mayor's Summit on a very closely related issue to the one you're dealing with. Some of you may recall that over at the Convention Center, where we were trying to work with, it was a summit on the impact of families and their people and families interacting with police. It was a very carefully phrased and long title. Ms. Konigsberg was actually, I think, attended that one. About 175 people, a lot of different folks trying to come up with recommendations on how to move forward on this very important issue. During that time, I actually became fairly well acquainted with the crisis intervention team members and Commander Chris Backus, now retired. You may recall Chris, as I can call him now, I guess. And he and I were actually, while he was on the force, cooking up an idea for leadership training for police officers using local resources rather than outside resources and unconventional, outside the military sort of paradigm of leadership training. Also, just for information, I've worked with different advocate groups. I was on the Albuquerque Healthcare for the Homeless Board for quite a number of years. I've facilitated planning retreats for things like groups like the Guardians ad Litem, and although it was a number of years ago, the ACLU board. So I'm fairly well acquainted with a number of aspects of our community. So I don't know, I can stand for questions on who I am, but I'm wondering whether we should just roll forward to the idea of the process guidelines.
That's well for
That's okay. So this is an attempt, as I mentioned to Mr. Krulman, I had actually done a little thinking. So this is not a hard proposal, but a set of talking points to figure out how the task force might usefully go forward in the next 6 weeks, I think, to actually get its work done. So there are the objectives. I kind of talked about that. The only thing there is, as the chair pointed out to me earlier, the January 31st deadline, while technically true for the task force report, in effect, we're probably trying to wrap up deliberations by the middle of the month. So with that, I'm thinking that to go forward effectively, that the agendas, the agendas that are scheduled, the meetings that are scheduled, and those that may be scheduled in January, should really focus on just hearing recommendations from the subcommittees and then deliberating on it and coming up with some decisions, rather than hearing more testimony. This may be a decision you've already made, but it seems that like that's an important starting point. I think that it might be useful to find some framework to compare subcommittee recommendations side by side. And to that end, I even have made a stab at a little worksheet, which after hearing the subcommittee reports is going to need major surgery. I don't know if it's practicable, but I do think that if we can, there is significant overlap between deliberations of the subcommittees, and it might be useful to have some tool to sort of look at things side by side, so that we're not looking at committee and deciding and making decisions on subcommittee recommendations consecutively, but we see them kind of across, in a cross-cutting kind of way. Now, I think the findings and recommendations format, I think is a really good one. The chair sent out a memo in the last few days reinforcing that, and the MGT report. It seems like the subcommittees are beginning to use that. I think that's great. And findings implies some kind of a priori topic, question, something, concern. It's an answer in search of a question. It's a problem in search of a topic. I think it would be useful to have some set of key topics, key questions that you're trying to all resolve together. And that would help, I think, focus your attention. And also, I think, I appreciated, I think it was Mr. Wagman and Mr. Bertoletti were saying that your initial agreement was you weren't going to solve all the problems in the world. Well, that's probably true. So what is it that you're going to say, this is what we focused on, this is what we were unable to deliberate on or chose not to deliberate on, because these are the key, the strategic, the important issues and recommendations. So I just think that some kind of set of key questions might be useful to help focus deliberations. That's another thing we can talk about. Just a couple things. I think my role is at your pleasure, but I think I can help moderate discussions, as I said, when the chair may want to actually focus substantively. The other thing I'd like to say about group decision making, while I'm sure you would like to achieve consensus or unanimity on all recommendations, this probably is not a practicable objective, and yet I think having 6 to 5 votes probably won't. I'm wondering what I'm suggesting that you consider whether that's sufficient, and maybe if it comes to need for a vote, some kind of supermajority rule, possibly a 7 minimum would be useful. And I do think I think minority reports are unavoidable, but I don't think that should be the spirit of it. I think they should be welcome. And because they may show some pathway to additional deliberation at some community level or some legislative, formal legislative level. So that, I just wanted to lay that out as sort of a set for discussion, and so I'll stand for questions.
I have a question. Would you be attending each subcommittee meeting, per se?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Waits, at this point, I'm not scheduled to, but would you think that would be useful?
It's just a question.
I think, Mr. Waits, I think that's something that we ought to consider. Anyway.
And the other thing you spoke about was the voting of 6 to 5 vote. Would 7 be a quorum? Is that what you're saying?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Waits, my experience is that on very sensitive issues, whether within an organization or some kind of community issue or some kind of multi-party issue, the idea of a simple majority sometimes is insufficient to demonstrate real will to move forward. Sometimes it is useful. I'm not against simple majority in many forms, but I'm wondering whether it'd be useful to consider the idea of some kind of 2/3 or vote kind of rule, which maybe would be 7 or 8 out of 11. But I think that's I think what I would propose is that's something that the task force should explicitly confront, is how do you know you've made a decision? And while unanimity would be probably desirable, I don't think it's practical. So what if that's not achievable, what would be a useful indicator of a task force decision? That's the question.
Thank you.
Mr. Simonson and Mr. Bray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So three comments, I guess. One, it wasn't clear, and maybe it was Mr. Waite's question that maybe not so clear anymore, whether or not we're planning any more subcommittee meetings or we're strictly planning on actually moving forward as a full task force. But before we get to answering that question, I want to reiterate my feeling that the process that we pursue from here forward needs to incorporate some more rigorous examination of the MGT recommendations and consideration of those recommendations and incorporation of them into our final document. I just think we will be missing the boat if we do not take a serious look at those and give them their due. And then thirdly, and forgive me if it sounds like I'm moving us back to square one a little bit, but I wonder if the process wouldn't be helped by opening up the facilitation with the question of what is the problem we're trying to solve here. We've delved into this. I know we're a long ways down the road. I know there's been a lot of assumptions about what the problem is, but we haven't ever had a conversation among ourselves, and this is a conversation that we have had sort of at a meta level within the management committee about what is the problem we're trying to, what do we perceive the problems that need to be solved actually are. Maybe if we took an hour, maybe if we took an hour and a half to discuss that at one of the meetings, it might help to frame later conversations and maybe help us even prioritize what needs to be, what are the recommendations that we really need to make sure we move forward, and maybe some that aren't quite as important.
Mr. Bray.
Did you want to?
Oh, I'm sorry, do you want to respond?
I don't know if you're looking for a response. Mr.
I wasn't.
Chairman, Mr. Simonson, on those points, I'm glad you brought up the MGT recommendations. I looked at them, and I wasn't certain as to what the relationship between that report and your deliberations was, so that was interesting. Regarding the last 2 points really talk about agenda design and process design. And so I'm suggesting questions, and I could make an initial play, but I don't want to presume because, as you said, you're 3/4 of the way through your work in terms of time. So whether the subcommittees meet or not was not something I was considering. I think it would be certainly their prerogative to continue meeting. I was thinking about how do we frame these committee of the whole discussions in a productive way. And then related to that, if you're talking about some kind of more general discussion, whether within these meetings or some Saturday morning or something, I don't know what you might be implying, but that would be fine. That really dovetails with my concern that we outline those key questions as I put them. What are you actually trying to address? And if you could boil it down to 3 or 4 or some manageable number, that might actually help your deliberations.
Just for some background, this is a chair commentary prerogative, I guess. Concerning the MGT reports, you mentioned it twice this evening. All the reports, the studies that have been done were distributed in full to every member of the task force, as well as we had UNM staff prepare summaries of those reports, kind of executive summary format, and it also examined differences between them. In addition, when we gave direction to the subcommittees, we suggested that as a starting point, they may want to consider looking at the MGT reports. Some of them did, some of them didn't. But Peter's mentioned twice now that we should do that, and that was in the instructions. We were hoping that everyone, that's why we did summaries of it. So going forward, certainly we want to do that, and that's what the instruction was to the subcommittees. I think we'll deal in a minute after we get through with questions of you and deciding whether or not we want to move forward with this process, we'll get into a discussion about subcommittees and meetings going forward. So I'm gonna put that on a back burner for the moment and entertain more questions for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, my question goes to Mr. Simonson's question as well. As far as your approach, will you be doing, engaging in problem solving with the committee, or will your focus be more seeking consensus amongst the different decisions that we're dealing with? And as far as the problem solving is concerned, there are a lot of different problem solving models out there. One I'm familiar with is a systems approach. It's time consuming, but it really does narrowly focus the issue on a specific problem. It takes a little bit of time, and I'm just wondering if you will be spending time working on the problem solving approach with us, or you will focus more on just reaching the consensus of the recommendations that are put forth on this. What will be your approach in facilitation?
Before you answer that, I have something that I will add to that. 'Cause what I've been sitting here thinking is, at our first meeting, we had to elect a chair. We didn't know each other. I think the issue came on the vice chair. And we didn't know each other. And there was one member who was absent. And we were 5-5. We'd split between two candidates. And in order to complete the election, we had to make a phone call to the absent member. And this was after trying to get somebody on either side of the 5-5 to move, and nobody was budging. Most of the subsequent votes that we've had since then have been, I don't know that we've ever had 11 people here, but they've been either unanimous or close to it. Yet when we've had a close vote, nobody was moving. So would you answer Mr. Pereira's question in that context and with that history? I don't think he can answer it unless he, and we haven't had close votes, close calls since then, I don't think. So we don't even know how we will deal with a question on which we're closely divided, because we haven't really had one since the first meeting when we were electing the chair or vice chair, and we didn't know each other. But it's going to happen now, we know.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Pereira, it's to be determined, but I would err on the side of being a process consultant rather than a consultant, tell you what you ought to do kind of consultant. I regard my work and my profession as being someone who asks questions. And hopefully they're reasonably on topic and reasonably incisive and reasonably encouraging for people to more deeply inquire into what they're doing. So along those lines, I may make proposals on how to go forward. I had not contemplated anything so formal as what you were suggesting. And I would like to talk with if you want to, talk with the task force members about it, but my off-the-cuff reaction is that that may be an imposition. We have to learn a new language, a new lexicon, a new kind of set of ground rules, if you will, and I'm not sure if there's time or energy to do that. So I'm thinking I would err more on let's go for simple. And let's go for what are you really tasked with is the question. And really it dovetails a little bit more of Mr. Simonson's thing about what are we really here to address. And it may have seemed self-evident, as I think I said to this management subcommittee, there's a lot of work out there a lot of literature about wicked problems. And for me, it boils down to when groups try to tackle them, there are early attempts at solutions and late attempts to redefine the problem. And so I bet on January 10th, they're going to still be saying, what the heck we started, and it's not to say that you have shirked your responsibility, it's just that we keep learning more as we go forward. So no, I think I'd be more of a little lighter touch process consultant guy, is what I would propose, if you want to work with me. Now, to Mr. Wagman's point, again, my experience is that on these very difficult issues, complex issues, some kind of decision rule should be thought about, should be contemplated. And that's really all I'm putting forward. I don't think that you're going, if you get 11-0 votes on the whole set of recommendations, I think that's going to be wonderful. I think, really, given the public comments I've heard even tonight and the constitution of the task force, but I did say I'm optimistic, but I don't want to look foolish. You know, so,
Be optimistic.
so all I'm saying, Mr. Wegman, is I think some conscious deliberation about a decision rule should be undertaken by the task force. And my initial proposal is 7, supermajority, but that's just to get the ball rolling.
Right, and to be honest, I think there's a lot of issues where it's gonna be hard to get to 7.
And therefore, if that's the case,
Right.
then the task force will have to say, it's a pretty close vote, or pretty close, it's a split, and there's a majority report, minority report, and you may pass it on to the city council without a strong recommendation. That may be a default mechanism that you have to use.
Before I call anybody else, another, and I forgot to mention this earlier when I was making comments, the discussion about what is it we're trying to solve. I hear that repeatedly from members of the task force, from Mr. Croman, and while it's not exactly that, I want to remind members of the task force and subcommittees that the management committee, in its instruction to the subcommittees, prepared a set of questions, uniform questions for all of the subcommittees to consider. And those were kind of the substantive core questions to be dealt with. May not have been all the questions, other questions come up in discussion, et cetera. But it did give them a roadmap of these are the main concerns that we've kind of heard and the things that we should be addressing. And we also asked them, as you pointed out earlier, to put them in a format so that they could be compared, and the format to be followed is the format that was followed in the MGT reports. So I just wanted to have that as background and remind the subcommittees again that you do have a set of questions to help zero in your discussions. Okay, other questions for Mr. Karpoff? Okay, then I'd like to entertain a motion, if you feel comfortable engaging Mr. Karpoff, engaging his services as a facilitator. We'll discuss this in more detail when we get past this point, but my sense is that we may need another couple of subcommittee meetings and then come back as a full task force, bringing in Mr. Karpoff. I don't think it's necessary, and please express your own opinions on this, to involve Mr. Karpoff in the subcommittee meetings. I think his services are going to be best utilized with the task force as a whole. The one last thing I wanted to add is, if we follow that format, we'd be looking at skip the whole last week in December, forget about that, nobody's going to want to meet then. So we'd have a couple of subcommittee, I'm just kind of laying out a potential roadmap. A couple of subcommittee meetings, then maybe a report back together, kind of like what we did tonight, but more meat on the bones of the subcommittee reports. And then I'm thinking, we haven't talked about this yet, but the possibility of an all-day retreat where we spend like, a good part of a day, like a 10 to 3 kind of thing, to get a handle on all of this and try and bring it into some tentative report form. Because I want to echo what I said to Mr. Karpoff earlier, and what you need to be aware of, is that we really need to complete our work by the middle of January to give a couple of weeks' time for Bruce and the UNM folks to put the report into a final form so we can review it before it gets submitted to City Council. So we don't have a lot of time. We really might have time for 2 subcommittee meetings, a retreat, and then maybe another facilitated meeting, and that's about what we've got left. So I'll stop there and see if somebody wants to move forward, make a motion to how we want to move forward. Ms. Konigsberg.
I move that we do in fact have Mr. Karpoff facilitate our final work meetings, however many we choose to have them. I think it'll be really valuable. It'll give Mr. Lippman a chance to put down his gavel and fully participate without having to also try to manage which group that can sometimes be unruly, so we move that we do that.
Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded. I'll open it up for discussion.
Call for the question.
Go ahead, Chair.
You have a question?
Yeah. Is
That
this
was a
motion,
quick-
is this motion, I have a question about the motion. Is the motion at this point is just to use Mr. Karpoff, or is it to follow what the chair has just outlined as, because I have some different ideas about how we proceed from here. And if it's on the whole thing, I'll vote one way. If it's on whether or not to use Mr. Karpoff, I'll vote a different way.
No, the motion was.
My intent was to
Particular.
engage Mr. Karpoff, but Nancy, you made the motion.
To have Mr. Karpoff facilitate whatever number of meetings that we need as a group
Okay.
to finalize our, to come together and finalize our product.
Okay, let's have a 6-5 vote.
Is there any other discussion? The question's been called. All those in favor of engaging Mr. Karpoff, please raise your hands. Any opposed? No. Thank you very much, Mr. Karpoff. We look forward to working with you.
Chairman, thank you, task force members, look forward to it as well.
Could I, Mr. Karpoff, can I ask you to stay? Sure.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to keep,
Yeah, no, of course.
because I'd like to,
You should address the chair and
Sorry.
not people.
I'm sorry,
It's not right.
you're right, I apologize.
Okay. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is announcement of upcoming meetings. I threw a suggestion on the table, but let me open it up for discussion. You're aware of the time we have left, and obviously you have some opinions. I'll call you first.
What I'm thinking is that part of the reason perhaps that the subcommittees didn't follow and address exactly what was given up by the management subcommittee was that it was given up by the management subcommittee. And there was no not putting down the management subcommittee, just that it wasn't discussed, there wasn't buy-in, there wasn't anything. And then we all got to our subcommittee meetings and talked about what we wanted to talk about. What I learned certainly from the discussions in our subcommittee, I developed deeper opinions about almost every aspect from listening to the reports. That's what's happened with everybody. I think that the best way to move on from here is to have a session where we throw out ideas about what problems are we trying to solve. Identify those. That's the first order. I think no more subcommittee meetings, because I think they've served a great purpose. They've focused everybody. We've thought about things more deeply, not just in our own subcommittee. What problems are we trying to resolve? And once we've identified those problems, then we start working on, okay, how to resolve those problems. Because one thing I've seen is in the subcommittee meetings is different subcommittees are going in different directions. They'll continue to do that. We'll just get farther apart. Let's figure out what we're trying to solve, then let's work together to try to address those issues. And that's the way I propose to move forward.
Other comments, suggestions? Mr. Pereira.
And then we go to your retreat idea, because that sounds like it would be a lengthy process to pull all of us together and let's start to attack specific issues. There's going to be a number of ideas out there, so if that's acceptable, we might look at that retreat suggesting as a way to accomplish as much as we can in the city.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from two people, if I'm hearing it correctly, is that Mr. Wagman is suggesting that we have a facilitated discussion either in place of or before we have any other subcommittee meetings, if we in fact have any further subcommittee meetings. And Mr. Parade, you're suggesting that perhaps that first facilitated discussion be a retreat. Did I characterize that correctly? Okay. So just wanted to clarify that so everybody understood what had been proposed. Mr. Loy.
I think that the subcommittee meetings are essential. The only real work that I've seen that, in my humble opinion, that we've seen accomplished was what I've seen on the reports submitted by the subcommittees here. We get together as 11 people and we're off all over the charts. But what I've seen come in from the subcommittees, whether I agree with them necessarily or not, are actually meat and potatoes saying, okay, this is what we're doing. And I know that our group with Ralph, we did review, it may not have been in our notes very well, but we did review the MGT report, the notes submitted by individual members of this task force. I certainly want more subcommittee meetings, because that's only where I've seen stuff come out of, where I can see a work product starting to form.
Okay. Mr. Waits, yes.
I agree. I think there's a lot of work that's been done, and I think that work needs to be concluded, good or bad. I think I agree with you. Let's close it out and finalize it and go forward from there.
So are you saying you're agreeing, I just want to be clear with Mr. Loy that we need more subcommittee meetings?
I think
Or are
the
you saying-
subcommittee meetings are important. I think they need to be closed out, meaning that the work that they've done needs to be concluded.
So
Then
they
we
should
all
have more subcommittee meetings?
review.
Yeah, I'm just,
Okay.
I just want to understand.
You should have more subcommittee meetings
Okay, to finish their work.
to finish the work that
Okay.
they've done. I'm sorry I didn't
It's okay.
articulate it.
When you said close out,
Well,
it kind of threw me, but I got you.
That's my background.
Okay. Any other comments? We have two kind of ideas kicking around. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, here's possibly a way to go. You already have full task force meetings scheduled for the 11th and 18th of December, is that correct? Or not?
Yeah, but those are placeholders. We don't have to have them.
I was, could you not maintain those? I mean, you're on a fast track, so
Yes, we
shouldn't you maintain those on people's calendars and have the subcommittees meet as they need to around those meetings? But the full task force continues to meet on a weekly basis, and we have a common framework that all subcommittees work from, and the reports can become more detailed, more substantive, and as you were implying earlier, there could be more debate and discussion about the overlaps and the distinctions. I think I may be guilty of trying to chart a middle course here, but I think Mr. Wagner's saying was we just got started. The task force needs to talk in a cross-cutting way, and Mr. Roy and Mr. Waits are saying we can still have some more work to do at the local level, if you will. And I think it's a both and.
I make that statement because being the new person on the committee is each report has more work to do. So when is that work going to be completed is what I'm getting at. And I think having those meetings, continue those sub-meetings is going to allow them to complete that work. And then we, as one unit, we come together and say, hey, this is what we've done. And we engage you. So that's just my thought.
I think that's an excellent idea. Just again, for your background, we had talked about that initially when we formed the subcommittees. The feeling among the task force was, however, that asking people to go to 2 meetings a week was a bit much. But we're running out of time now, so maybe they'd be more amenable to looking at that possibility. Just exactly what you said. To echo what he said, we would keep full task force meetings on the 11th and the 18th. But in the meantime, you would still meet as subcommittees, report to the full task force at our scheduled meetings. And I still want to hold out the possibility of an all-day retreat in January, but we don't have to decide that tonight. Ms. Konigsberg.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Karpoff, I want to be clear that if we do have subcommittee meetings and full committee meetings each week, what happens at the full committee meetings when we continue to have partial process here? I don't want to, I mean, this 2 meetings a week, especially if it's in the middle of the day, there's some of us who've got day jobs, and I want to make sure that our time is used well. I'm committed to this process, I've been doing my homework, however, I do not want to be duplicating efforts. So what's your thinking on dual meetings?
Mr. Chair, Ms. Konigsberg, I think the subcommittees would meet if they feel they needed to meet. In other words, the POC subcommittee has submitted a set of recommendations. After having heard the other subcommittee reports, do they need to go back and do a little tinkering? That would seem to me to be the reason to meet as a subcommittee. But if they don't, then we come back. But otherwise, as Mr. Waits is suggesting, there needs to be a deadline for completion of the subcommittee work. But I'm thinking it's an as-needed approach. So just to make sure everything's in a common framework, if you will. Or for going forward. Alternatively, I can work with Mr. Perlman and Ms. Yara maybe to try to craft some sort of framework for people to put their recommendations in, so that there's a side-by-side comparison ability. But I don't know if they need to be, that's my point.
Thank you. Mr. Simons.
Well, maybe this is the question you were actually asking, Nancy, which is for me, I'm not so concerned about whether the subcommittee meetings are going to be useful. It's my bigger question is, are the collective meetings going to be useful if the subcommittee is really carrying that work? I also don't want to commit to 2 meetings a week, because they will be the only two weekend, the only two days of the week that I don't have evening meetings right now. So if I'm going to commit to those, my week is full. And so I don't want to waste one of those nights if we're not going to have a productive session, if really it's the work in the subcommittees where we're getting stuff done.
If I can make a suggestion, this is what I'm hearing. We need a deadline, that's clear. It sounds like some people feel like they need to meet in subcommittees and some they don't. So I'm going to pick up on what Mr. Karpoff just said and reiterate my suggestion that we take a 2-week break. During those 2 weeks, the subcommittees that need to meet will meet with a deadline to complete your work right after Christmas. So the first week in January, we'll have a facilitated meeting here, and at that meeting, I'm thinking out loud now, at that meeting we can decide, when we see how it functions and how much work we get done, whether or not we'll need a retreat, say, a week from then. Just a suggestion. Ms. Konigsberg.
Mr. Chair, I actually strongly disagree. We've got the 2 task force meetings set up. I'd say let's get to work. Let's get the paper up on the board. Let's get going. And as we do the process as a whole, if subcommittee wants to take their own time to go ahead and figure out a component of it, I agree with Mr. Loy that working in the small groups I think has been very productive. However, I think we're at the point, looking down, the light at the end of the tunnel's going to be the oncoming train, that we need to get out as a group, and that as with the facilitation, we see how the pieces fit together, and when there's a lot of tension around it, if the small groups want to get together to try to iron out some pieces, I think that would be the best use of our time.
Okay. Mr. Wagner, and then I'll call on you.
I completely agree with what Nancy just said, and I would add to it that one thing that I notice is that the subcommittees don't completely agree with each other. And as long as we meet separately, going off in directions which don't agree with each other, that just delays and makes harder the process of reconciling and getting things together. And I think that it's not just, I think it could be very counterproductive to go to, I think subcommittees could meet once we've all got a set of issues to address, and then come back and help clarify those issues. But if we go off, call this off for 2 weeks and go meet separately and go in further in different directions and come back, I think we've got an impossible job.
Okay, Mr. Karpoff and then Mr. Bertolet.
Usually I like to sort of listen to, Mr. Chair, the group and sort of do it in a collaborative way, but let me be very direct here. My experience is that volunteer groups have a certain amount of energy, and if you waste the energy, it's just not gonna, things are just not gonna happen. If people can commit to one meeting a week, and if we can make it a productive meeting a week, then let's do that. And the other thing is, it is, January 15th is very close with the end of year holiday, Christmas and New Year's and so forth. So, if people already have the 11th and the 18th on their schedule, it's in their thinking, then I would recommend strongly that we keep to that. That we probably also, if Wednesdays work, then maybe we make the 8th and 15th, because I think those are the 7th and the 14th or whatever. Put January dates on people's schedules. And further, Mr. Chair, if we want to do a longer retreat kind of thing, why not make it a longer evening meeting rather than an additional day? Just so that you maintain the rhythm that people are familiar with, and they don't have to reorganize their lives with additional times that might divert their attention.
Thank you. I saw him, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with that. I've felt that for a long time, that the subcommittee work is great, but it's time for the task force to be here as a whole and deal with the issues. And until we do that, we're not going to really resolve very much, and we don't have that much time left to do that. So I would really, since I'm gone anyway, I would urge you to meet every day.
You get it done before I come back. Mr. Arias, yes.
Like my committee, I think most committees are like ours, we're about 80% there. We just gotta clarify a couple of things, and maybe we'll agree, maybe we won't. But I think we need to just bring whatever we don't agree to this group, the broader group, and say yay or nay on this, and then let's proceed.
Okay.
Because I think we're gonna come to a pass where we're not gonna agree on everything, and I think that's what the broader group is for, and then we just close it out.
Okay. Here's what I'm hearing. The sense, and I can call for a motion if you want, but that we keep the dates as full task force meetings, that if subcommittees need to meet and talk to each other, they'll do that. The only thing I'm going to add is that you, Mr. Karpoff, had suggested that maybe you and Stephanie could work up a framework maybe along these lines, incorporate the material that's been decided on already by the subcommittees, and we can use this as a framework to begin deliberating these issues at full task force meetings. I see people shaking their heads, so why don't I ask for a motion that sets out the following things. We keep the 2 dates in December, that we plan some dates in January, and I'd like to throw one more, well, no, we'll do it now. I was going to say, set aside a Saturday date just to have it on the calendar in case we need to do that. But your suggestion to have a longer evening meeting might work if we could meet, like, we don't have to decide this tonight, but like 4 o'clock, and we have dinner brought in, and because if we wait until 5:30, it gets really late, and I think that's going to be a long meeting. Okay, so I'll entertain a motion. Whoever wants to make one. I'll make it. Yeah, this group needs motions. Yeah.
Just to be clear, we have 4 Wednesdays left, because January 1st is a Wednesday, so that's out. I'm looking at my calendar correctly. So we have the 2 scheduled in December, then we have the 8th and the 15th. So we have 4 meetings left. Just want everybody to be aware of that.
Well, that,
At the
yeah,
most, at the most.
that may be why we may need a retreat. Is why I'm saying that,
So I think,
I hate to say this, but I'm not real confident that we have enough time.
Mr. Chairman, I asked
Just to
Mr. Karpoff a question. May I?
Oh, yes.
Mr. Karpoff, based on your experience, if we were to, say, devote next Wednesday's meeting to determining what problems we're going to address, that's the primary focus of business on next Wednesday's meeting. And notwithstanding what Mr. Lippman said about, yeah, it does get late if you start at 5:30, but people would. In your experience, is it realistic for us to think that in a meeting going from 5:30 to 9:30, we would be able to get that done next Wednesday so we can go forward from there?
Chairman, Mr. Wyman, yes. I think, yeah.
In that case, I move that we schedule meetings for the already scheduled December 11th and the 18th, plus January 8th and January 15th, and that the December 11th meeting be scheduled from 5:30 to 9:30, and that the sole item on the agenda, other than perhaps public comments and the necessary business of approving the agenda, calling to order, etc., be the identification of the problems that the task force will address.
Is there a second to that motion?
I'd like to ask a question. Are we, did he just say that we're going to eliminate public comments?
No.
No,
Oh, but I'm not voting for it.
no, he didn't
He
say.
didn't say that, okay.
No, he did not say that.
No, but are we? I mean,
No, we're
I
not
think
going
we'd
to.
listen to as much public comment as we can get, if we could just get to the issue.
Well, I think
But
that's part of the Open Meetings Act, so
Oh,
I think we have to adhere to that.
sorry.
Well, wait a minute, it still needs a second.
Second.
Okay.
Mr.
Now we're in
Chair,
discussion.
Just a comment, it is not necessary to have public comment within the Open Meetings Act. It's just something the task force has done because we were soliciting,
Okay.
comments, so that's not required.